Snow possesses a terrifying silence right before it buries you alive. Most people don't know that. They see winter as a season of holiday lights, warm hearths, and soft picturesque mornings. But Caleb O'Reilly knew the unforgiving truth of nature. When you've spent months lying utterly motionless in hostile high-altitude environments, reading wind patterns and microscopic shifts in barometric pressure just to stay breathing, you learn to spot the invisible footprints of incoming disaster. So, when he began hauling massive raw timber to construct a second seemingly absurd outer barricade around his secluded mountain property, his neighbors pointed and howled with laughter. They called him a paranoid relic of a forgotten war. Then, the sky turned to solid iron, the power grid shattered, and the laughter died in their throats. Boundary County, Idaho sits at the very edge of the American wilderness, a rugged expanse of towering pines and jagged peaks that bleed seamlessly into the Canadian border. It was a place where people moved to be left alone to carve out a quiet existence away from the noise of modern civilization. Caleb O'Reilly had purchased his 12-acre plot and the modest single-story log cabin on it 3 years after receiving his honorable discharge. For a decade, he had served as a Marine Corps scout sniper, a ghost in the mountains of Afghanistan and the scorching valleys of the Middle East. He had brought home commendations, a slight limp in his left leg from a shrapnel tear, and a mind that never truly stopped calculating threats. To the locals in the nearby town of Bonners Ferry, Caleb was a polite but distant figure. He paid for his groceries in cash at the local grocer, tipped well at the feed store, and never stayed for small talk. His cabin was perched on a gentle slope at the end of a long, winding dirt road surrounded by dense lodgepole pines. It was a solid structure built in the late 80s with thick walls and a good metal roof. To anyone else, it was more than enough to withstand the typical Idaho winters. But late that September, Caleb noticed something that set his teeth on edge. It started with the wildlife. The deer, usually abundant in the valley until mid-November, began migrating south weeks earlier than he had ever seen. The squirrels and chipmunks were frantically hoarding, working with a frantic, desperate energy. But it was the moss on the north side of his pines that truly caught his attention. It was thickening, rapidly growing denser and darker, preparing for something brutal. Caleb spent 3 nights sitting on his porch, a notebook on his knee, watching the night sky and feeling the subtle biting shift in the thermals rolling down from the peaks. The barometric pressure was behaving erratically, dropping in sudden sharp spikes that the local meteorologists on the radio casually dismissed as seasonal fluctuations. Caleb didn't trust meteorologists. He trusted his gut, and his gut, honed by years of trusting his life, to the wind, was screaming that a catastrophic atmospheric anomaly was building in the Arctic. The next morning, the heavy machinery arrived. It started with an excavator, a massive yellow beast that Caleb rented from a bewildered equipment dealer 2 towns over. For 5 days, from dawn until the last sliver of twilight faded, Caleb ran the machine, trenching a deep, continuous perimeter exactly 4 feet away from the existing exterior walls of his cabin. His closest neighbor, Richard Dempsey, lived a 1/4 mile down the mountain. Richard was a retired corporate executive from California who had bought a massive, sprawling 3-story chalet to live out his rugged retirement. Richard loved the aesthetic of the wilderness, but possessed none of the respect for it. He owned a shiny, brand-new snowmobile. He rarely used a pristine backup generator he had never tested, and a loud, booming voice that carried through the thin mountain air. On the 6th day of construction, Richard ambled up Caleb's driveway, flanked by his golden retriever. He wore an expensive designer flannel shirt and held a steaming Yeti mug of coffee. "O'Reilly!" Richard bellowed over the roar of the excavator. "What in God's name are you doing up here?" "Striking oil!" Caleb powered down the machine, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. He looked down at the deep trench, then back to Richard. "Building a wall, Richard." A wall," Richard scoffed, looking at the perfectly intact cabin. "You've already got walls, buddy. What, are the Canadians invading, or did you watch too many zombie movies over the weekend?" "Thermal mass," Caleb replied quietly, ignoring the jab. I'm building an exterior gabion and timber wall, leaving a 4-foot air gap between the cabin and the new structure. Richard blinked, trying to process the engineering terminology. An air gap, Caleb, you're ruining your property value. You're turning a beautiful mountain cabin into a prison compound. It's going to look hideous. It's not for aesthetics, Caleb said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. It's a windbreak and an insulation envelope. The farmer's almanac and the pressure systems are pointing to a bad winter. Really bad. Richard threw his head back and laughed, a loud, echoing sound that startled a flock of ravens from the pines. A bad winter, Caleb, my friend. We have snowplows, we have propane. I just had 1,000 gallons delivered. You're working yourself to the bone over a few extra inches of snow. Relax. Drink a beer. You military guys, you always need a war to fight, don't you? Caleb didn't smile. He just stared at Richard with eyes that had watched men die through a telescopic sight. Nature doesn't care about your propane tank, Richard. Have a good day. Undeterred by the mockery, Caleb's work only accelerated. Deliveries of massive pressure-treated 8x8 timber beams began arriving on flatbed trucks. Following the wood came pallets of heavy-gauge steel mesh wire. Working entirely alone, Caleb began assembling what looked like a medieval fortification. He erected the massive timber frames, then attached the steel mesh to create thick hollow baskets, gabions. He didn't stop there. Using the excavator, he began filling these steel and timber baskets with the earth and shale he had dug from the trench, intermixed with crushed river rock. The result was a secondary wall 3 feet thick and 10 feet high, completely encircling his home, leaving only a small, heavily reinforced tunnel leading to his front door and narrow angled gaps aligned perfectly with his windows to allow light in without letting the wind strike the glass directly. To the untrained eye, it was an eyesore. It was the frantic, manic project of a deeply paranoid man. But mechanically, it was a masterpiece of survival engineering. The thick rock and dirt wall provided immense thermal mass. It would absorb any faint sunlight during the day and block the biting winds entirely. More importantly, the 4-foot air gap between this new fortress wall and the actual cabin created a dead air space, one of the most effective forms of natural insulation on the planet. By late October, the wall was complete, and by then, Caleb O'Reilly was the laughingstock of the entire county. The rumors spread faster than a wildfire in dry brush. In small towns, eccentric behavior is a currency, and Caleb had just minted a fortune. Down at the Moose Valley Diner, the locals gathered over black coffee and greasy eggs, swapping exaggerated tales of the sniper's castle. Samuel Peterson, a grizzled local mechanic who usually kept to himself, sat in a booth listening to Richard Dempsey hold court. Richard had taken it upon himself to be the primary chronicler of Caleb's supposed descent into madness. I'm telling you, the guy has completely lost his marbles. Richard laughed loudly, gesturing with a piece of toast. He spent God knows how much money building a dirt wall around a perfectly good house. He's out there hauling rocks like a modern-day pharaoh building his own tomb. I tried to talk sense into him, but you know how these PTSD guys are, always waiting for the sky to fall. Maybe he knows something we don't, Richard Samuel muttered into his coffee cup. Caleb ain't stupid. I saw the joints on those timbers when I drove past. That's professional engineering. Oh, come on, Sam, Richard countered, slapping the table. He mumbled something about thermal mass and a bad winter. Look out the window. Richard pointed to the diner's large glass front. It was the first week of November, and it was unusually warm. The sun was shining brightly, and the temperature was hovering around a balmy 60 degrees. People were walking around in light jackets. The local news had projected a mild El Niño-driven winter with below-average snowfall. It's T-shirt weather, Richard proclaimed triumphantly. And poor Caleb is up there locked inside a mud hut. My wife Catherine actually feels sorry for him. She wanted to bring him a casserole, but I told her he might shoot her for breaching his perimeter. The diner erupted in chuckles. A few days later, Richard decided to host an impromptu end-of-autumn barbecue at his sprawling chalet. It was a thinly veiled excuse to show off his new outdoor kitchen and his state-of-the-art backup generator. He invited half the mountain road, including as a joke Caleb. To everyone's surprise, Caleb actually showed up. He walked up Richard's paved, heated driveway wearing a simple flannel shirt and worn denim. He didn't bring a side dish, nor did he carry a beer. He moved with a quiet, efficient grace that seemed entirely out of place among the loud, tipsy neighbors. "O'Reilly, you made it out of the bunker," Richard cheered, holding up a pair of tongs. The guests turned some hiding smirks behind their solo cups. "Tell me, did you set up landmines yet, or is the wall enough?" A few people chuckled. Caleb walked up to the deck, his eyes sweeping over the crowd, noting the expensive fragile glass railings of Richard's deck, the exposed plumbing of the outdoor kitchen, and the massive uninsulated windows of the chalet. "The wall is sufficient," Caleb said simply. Catherine Dempsey, a woman who wore too much jewelry for a mountain town, approached him with a forced, pitying smile. "Caleb, we really are just teasing. But truthfully, why go to all that trouble? If the power goes out, we just turn on the generator. Look." She pointed proudly to the massive Generac unit sitting on a concrete pad next to the house. "It powers the whole house automatically. Heat lights, Wi-Fi. What more do you need?" Caleb looked at the generator. It was a top-of-the-line model, but then his eyes drifted down to the fuel line and the exposed battery casing. "It's a good machine," Caleb observed quietly, "but it's rated for standard winter conditions. Have you winterized the oil, swapped it for a synthetic low-viscosity blend? Have you insulated the battery?" Richard rolled his eyes, flipping a burger aggressively. "It's an automatic, Caleb. You just let it do its thing. The installer said it's good to go. Mate, and your fuel." Caleb pressed his voice, remaining level, though an undercurrent of genuine warning crept in. "Propane stops vaporizing at 44 degrees below zero. It turns into a useless puddle of liquid. If it gets colder than that, your generator is an expensive lawn ornament." The deck went silent. The neighbors stared at Caleb, a mix of annoyance and discomfort washing over them. "MOF 44 below." Richard laughed, but it sounded slightly strained. "Caleb, the lowest it's ever gotten here in recorded history is 20 below. And that was 30 years ago. You're letting your imagination run wild, pal. Take a burger and relax." Caleb didn't take the burger. He looked up at the sky. It was perfectly blue, not a cloud in sight. But high above, at the very edge of the stratosphere, he knew the wind currents were fracturing. He could feel it in his joints, an aching pressure that told him the atmosphere was about to violently collapse. "I appreciate the invitation," Richard Caleb said, turning to leave. He paused at the edge of the stairs and looked back at the group of laughing, comfortable people. "When the temperature drops, don't trust the glass. Move to the center of your house. Keep your axes sharp." He walked away down the driveway. Behind him, Richard shook his head. Nut job. Absolute nut job. For the next 2 weeks, the weather remained unseasonably mild. The mockery in the town grew to a crescendo. Teenagers drove by Caleb's property honking their horns and yelling out the windows. Someone even spray-painted a crude smiley face on one of the outer timber beams facing the road. Caleb didn't paint over it. He spent his time chopping cords of dense oak and stacking them in the 4-foot air gap between his walls. He filled 50-gallon drums with water and purified them. He checked his chimney flues, cleaned his wood stove, and waited. Then came the evening of November 28th. The local radio station was playing classic rock when the broadcast suddenly cut out, replaced by the jarring, ear-piercing tone of the emergency alert system. Samuel Peterson was in his garage working on a truck when the alert sounded. He wiped his greasy hands and turned up the volume. The automated voice sounded different this time. It wasn't the usual warning about a severe thunderstorm or a standard winter advisory. "The National Weather Service has issued a catastrophic winter weather warning for Boundary Bonner and Kootenai counties. An unprecedented sudden stratospheric warming event has collapsed the polar vortex. A massive, densely packed Arctic air mass is descending rapidly. Temperatures are expected to drop 50 degrees within a 2-hour window. Wind gusts may exceed 80 miles per hour. This is a life-threatening situation. Do not travel. Secure all outdoor items. Ensure secondary heating sources are ready." Samuel looked out his garage window. The sun was setting, casting a sickly, bruised purple hue over the mountains. The air was dead still, unnaturally still. 3 miles up the mountain, Richard Dempsey was sitting in his living room pouring a glass of expensive bourbon. Catherine was reading a magazine on the sofa. "Did you hear that alert?" Catherine asked, frowning. "Sounded serious." "They always make it sound serious," Richard dismissed, taking a sip. "It's just a cold snap. We'll turn up the thermostat. We'll be fine." But up at the end of the dirt road, Caleb O'Reilly was already inside. The heavy reinforced steel door of his cabin was locked, dead-bolted, and sealed with weather stripping. He stood by the window looking through the narrow slit of the outer wall out into the darkening forest. The needles on the pine trees weren't swaying. They were vibrating. Caleb walked over to his analog barometer on the wall. The needle was plummeting so fast he could almost see it moving. It was a pressure drop so violent it felt as though the atmosphere was being sucked out into space. He calmly walked to his wood stove, struck a match, and lit the kindling. "Here it comes," Caleb whispered to the empty room. It hit at exactly 6:14 p.m. There was no gradual build-up, no gentle fluttering of snowflakes to announce the storm's arrival. One moment the mountain was locked in a tense, freezing silence. The next, a deafening mechanical roar ripped through the valley. It sounded like a fleet of freight trains descending from the sky. The temperature drop was physically shocking. At 6 p.m., the thermometer on Richard Dempsey's back porch read a comfortable 32 degrees. By 6:20 p.m., the digital display flickered wildly before settling at -15. And it was still plummeting. The wind struck first. 80-mile-per-hour gusts slammed into the sides of the mountains, snapping 100-foot pine trees like dry toothpicks. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the darkness like cannon fire. Then came the snow, not soft flakes, but microscopic, razor-sharp shards of ice driven horizontally by the hurricane-force winds. It was a whiteout of apocalyptic proportions. Inside the Dempsey chalet, the impact of the storm was immediate and terrifying. The massive panoramic windows in Richard's living room, the ones he boasted, gave him the best view in the county, suddenly bowed inward under the immense pressure of the wind. "Richard!" Catherine screamed, dropping her magazine as the house shuddered violently. The wooden frame of the chalet groaned a high-pitched, agonizing sound. "It's just wind, Kathy." "The house is structurally sound," Richard yelled back, though his voice lacked its usual arrogant bass. He walked toward the window to look out, but he couldn't see past the glass. The air outside was a solid, churning wall of white. Then the lights flickered. Once. Twice. Down in the valley, the local substation, unequipped for the sheer violence of the ice accumulation, and the falling timber detonated in a brilliant shower of blue sparks that briefly illuminated the blinding storm. The Dempsey house plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. The hum of the central heating died instantly. "Richard," Catherine shrieked again, her voice tight with panic. "Calm down! Calm down!" Richard fumbled in the dark, his hands shaking as he pulled his smartphone from his pocket and turned on the flashlight. "The generator will kick on. 10 seconds. Just count to 10. They stood in the dark living room, the wind screaming against the glass, and counted 1, 2, 3, 10, 15, 30. Nothing happened. "Why isn't it turning on?" Catherine demanded, grabbing his arm. The ambient temperature in the large, open concept house was already dropping noticeably. The large windows, without the heat to fight back the cold, were becoming massive conduits for the freezing air outside. I don't know," Richard stammered, his mind racing. "Let me go check the panel. I'll override it manually." He threw on a heavy parka, grabbed a flashlight, and forced open the side door. The moment he unlatched it, the wind tore the door from his grip, slamming it against the exterior siding with enough force to crack the hinges. The cold hit Richard like a physical punch to the chest. It instantly sucked the breath from his lungs. The air was so brutally frigid, it burned his throat. He fought his way to the generator pad, shielding his face from the flying ice. He shone the light on the control panel. The digital screen was blank. He hit the manual override switch. Nothing. He hit it again harder, panic rising in his chest. Then he shined the light down at the base of the unit. The battery casing, exposed to the raw -30-degree wind chill, was coated in a thick layer of rime ice. The cold had completely killed the battery's voltage. Even worse, the synthetic oil inside the engine block oil. Richard had never thought to upgrade for extreme Arctic conditions had thickened into a viscous sludge. The engine couldn't turn over even if it had power. Caleb's quiet warning at the barbecue suddenly echoed in Richard's mind. Have you winterized the oil? Have you insulated the battery? No, Richard whispered into the howling dark. No, no, no. He struggled back inside, using all his weight to drag the door shut and lock it. He stood in the mudroom, shivering uncontrollably, his beard already coated in white frost. "Richard, is it on?" Catherine called out from the dark living room, wrapped in a blanket. It's dead," Richard said, his voice hollow. The battery froze. Up the mountain, Caleb O'Reilly sat in an armchair by his wood stove, a steaming mug of black tea in his hand, reading a dog-eared copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations by the warm orange glow of a kerosene lantern. The chaos of the blizzard outside was barely a whisper in his cabin. His design was working flawlessly. When the 80-mile-per-hour gusts hit his property, they didn't slam into the cabin walls. They crashed against the outer ring of timber and earth-filled gabions. The immense weight and density of the 3-foot-thick secondary wall absorbed the kinetic energy of the wind, completely deflecting it up and over the roof. Furthermore, the 4-foot air gap between the gabion wall and the cabin acted perfectly. The cold could not penetrate the dead air space. The earth in the gabions had absorbed the heat from the past week's unseasonable sun and was now slowly radiating it back into the gap. Inside the cabin, Caleb only needed a small, steadily burning fire in the stove to keep the temperature at a balmy 68 degrees. He didn't have massive exposed windows leaking heat. He had thick insulated walls protected by an unbreachable fortress. He didn't rely on a fragile electronic grid or an automated generator. He had stacked dry wood, gravity-fed water, and profound, undisturbed silence. As Caleb turned a page in his book, he heard a faint, distant crack, followed by a muffled rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. He closed the book and set down his tea. He knew that sound. It was the sound of a roof failing under the weight of sudden, massive snow accumulation. The blizzard wasn't just dropping snow, it was creating monstrous 15-foot drifts, packing the snow down with hurricane winds, turning it as heavy and dense as wet concrete. Caleb walked to the front of his cabin, unlatched his heavy steel door, and stepped into the small reinforced tunnel that connected his cabin door to the exit of the outer wall. He unbolted the heavy timber gate of the outer wall and cracked it open just an inch. The sheer violence of the storm outside was incomprehensible. The air was a chaotic, swirling vortex of blinding white. The temperature reading on his protected porch thermometer was -42 degrees. He peered down the mountain through the narrow crack. He couldn't see Richard's house. He couldn't see anything. But he knew they were down there. The people who had laughed, the people who had pointed, they were down there in homes built for comfort, not survival, facing a storm designed to kill. Caleb secured the heavy timber gate, sliding the massive steel drop bar into place. He walked back into the warmth of his cabin, the quiet embrace of the fortress he had built with his own 2 hands. He stoked the fire, adding 2 more logs. The laughter had stopped. The real test had just begun. By 2 a.m., the interior of the Dempsey chalet had become an icy tomb. The temperature inside the sprawling, open-concept living room had plummeted to 9 degrees Fahrenheit, and the air was growing colder with every passing minute. Without the constant hum of the forced air furnace to fight back the Arctic onslaught, the house's structural vulnerabilities were laid bare. The expansive double-paned windows, designed to frame picturesque sunsets, were now acting as massive thermal bridges, sucking the residual heat out of the room and radiating pure, biting cold. Richard and Catherine had retreated to the downstairs half-bathroom, the only room in the center of the house without windows. They were huddled together in the dry bathtub, buried beneath every down comforter, wool blanket and winter coat they could tear from the closets. Catherine was shaking so violently that her teeth clicked together in a rapid, uncontrollable rhythm. Richard, she stuttered, her breath pluming in white clouds in the dark, cramped space. I can't feel my toes. It hurts. It hurts so bad. Just keep moving them, Kathy. Wiggle them. Richard commanded, though his own voice was dangerously thin and slurred. The arrogance that had defined him just hours earlier was entirely gone, replaced by a primal, suffocating terror. He held his smartphone. The battery was at 14%. There was no cell service. The nearest cell tower had likely snapped under the ice load hours ago. He had tried the gas fireplace in the living room earlier, only to discover a cruel twist of modern convenience. The electronic ignition valve required a steady 120-volt current to open the gas line. Without power, it was nothing more than a decoration. Outside, the storm was escalating. The wind didn't howl. It screamed with a high-pitched mechanical shrieking sound that vibrated through the floorboards. The snowfall was so heavy and relentless that it was burying the first floor of the house. "They'll send a plow," Richard muttered, trying to convince himself. "The county has massive plows. They'll clear the main road and come up here." But deep down, Richard knew the terrifying truth. No snowplow could move in this. The visibility was absolute zero, and the drifts were likely towering over 10 feet high. They were entirely cut off from the world, trapped in a multi-million-dollar freezer. Up the mountain, Caleb O'Reilly was awake. He rarely slept for more than 3 hours at a time, a residual habit from his deployments in the Korengal Valley. He sat at his sturdy wooden table, cleaning the bolt of his hunting rifle by the warm, steady light of an oil lamp. The temperature inside his cabin was a comfortable 65 degrees. The gabion wall outside was taking a brutal beating, but it was holding firm. The crushed rock and earth within the steel mesh cages absorbed the punishing kinetic blows of the 80-mile-per-hour gusts. More importantly, the immense volume of snow was acting as an additional layer of insulation. As the snow piled up against the exterior of the wall, it sealed off any remaining drafts, locking the cabin inside a perfect thermal bubble. Caleb paused as cleaning his hands, freezing over the rifle parts. He tilted his head. Over the deafening roar of the blizzard, a new sound cut through the night. It was a sharp, explosive crack like a cannon firing, followed instantly by a massive groaning shudder that Caleb felt in the soles of his boots. He stood up instantly. He knew the timber on this mountain. He knew the sound of a 100-foot Douglas fir finally succumbing to the immense weight of wet snow and hurricane winds. And based on the muffled direction of the impact, he knew exactly where it had fallen. A quarter-mile down the slope, the Dempsey Chalet was in ruins. The massive fir tree, easily weighing 3 tons, had snapped halfway up its trunk. It crashed down onto the chalet's vaulted roof like a god's hammer. The structural beams of the house splintered instantly. The roof caved in, bringing down drywall insulation and shattered glass into the living room. The impact violently shook the foundation. In the downstairs bathroom, Richard and Catherine screamed as the ceiling above them buckled, raining plaster dust and debris down onto their blankets. Suddenly, the cold in the house went from passive to active. With the roof breached, the blizzard poured directly into the living room. The localized pressure inside the house equalized with the storm outside, creating a vacuum effect that sucked the remaining stagnant air out and replaced it with a roaring vortex of negative 40-degree wind and blinding snow. Richard forced the bathroom door open an inch and peered out. The hallway was unrecognizable. Snow was actively drifting across the hardwood floors. "We have to leave," Catherine sobbed hysterically, clutching his arm. "We're going to die in here, Richard. Leave and go where—" Richard shouted back, panic finally overriding his senses. "Our cars are buried. We can't survive out there for 5 minutes. O'Reilly!" Catherine cried out, her eyes wide with desperate realization. "Caleb, he built the wall. He has heat." Richard stared at her. The thought of crawling to the man he had mercilessly mocked, begging for his life, burned his pride. But as a fresh blast of sub-zero wind ripped the bathroom door from his grip and slammed it against the wall, his pride shattered completely. "Okay," Richard gasped. "Okay, put your boots on." Caleb did not hesitate. The golden rule of the scout snipers was simple: never leave a man behind. It didn't matter if that man was a friend to stranger or a pompous fool who had spent the last 2 months laughing at him. The mountain was trying to take a life, and Caleb was not going to allow it. He moved with rehearsed mechanical efficiency. He stripped off his flannel shirt and began layering. Moisture-wicking base layers, a dense fleece mid-layer, and finally his military-issue extreme cold-weather parka and bib overalls. He coated his cheeks, nose, and lips with a thick layer of Vaseline to prevent flash frostbite. He pulled on a balaclava, a thick wool beanie, and secured tinted double-pane tactical goggles over his eyes to protect against the flying ice shards. From his gear locker, he retrieved a heavy-duty plastic utility sled, the kind used for hauling fresh game out of the deep woods. He attached a 50-foot length of high-tensile paracord to the sled and tied the other end to a heavy carabiner, which he clipped to the reinforced belt of his overalls. Lastly, he strapped on a pair of wide-track aluminum snowshoes. He stepped into the air gap between his cabin and the outer wall, unlatched the heavy timber gate, and pushed. It wouldn't budge. The snowdrift on the outside was packed solid against the wood. Caleb gritted his teeth, braced his back against the cabin wall, planted his boots against the gate, and leg-pressed with all his might. The wood groaned, and the frozen drift cracked. He squeezed through the narrow opening and dragged the sled out behind him. The moment he stepped past the protection of his wall, the storm hit him like a physical blow. It was a chaotic, swirling void. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the piercing narrow beam of his high-lumen headlamp, which merely illuminated a dizzying wall of horizontal snow. The wind chill was easily negative 60 degrees. Every breath he took felt like swallowing broken glass. Navigating was impossible by sight. Caleb had to rely entirely on memory and the subtle slope of the terrain beneath his snowshoes. He aimed himself downhill, dragging the sled behind him, leaning heavily forward into the wind to keep from being blown backward. The quarter-mile trek, which usually took 5 minutes, took him nearly 40. He had to climb over massive invisible drifts and crawl under fallen timber that he couldn't see until his goggles bumped against the bark. His injured left leg throbbed fiercely, the old shrapnel wound aching in the deep freeze. Finally, a jagged, dark shape loomed out of the whiteout, the Dempsey Chalet. Caleb approached the structure and froze. The devastation was worse than he had calculated. The massive Douglas fir had cleaved the living room in two. The roof was entirely collapsed on the right side, and the grand windows were blown out. The interior of the house was a snow globe. "Richard!" Caleb roared, but the wind snatched the words from his mouth instantly. He unclipped the snowshoes, leaving them by the shattered doorframe, and stepped into the living room. Snow was knee-deep on the expensive Persian rugs. He swept his headlamp through the wreckage. Dempsey. A faint, muffled thumping sound came from the central hallway. Caleb waded through the snow and debris, his light catching the white door of the downstairs bathroom. He kicked the door open. The sight inside made Caleb's heart sink. Richard was slumped against the wall, clutching his right leg. A heavy wooden beam from the ceiling joists had crashed through the drywall and pinned his lower leg to the floor. Catherine was curled into a tight ball next to him, her eyes glassy, shivering so weakly it was barely noticeable. That was the most dangerous sign of all. When the shivering stops, hypothermic coma is minutes away. Richard looked up at Caleb, his face ghostly white, his lips a dark bruised blue. He didn't look like a wealthy executive anymore. He looked like a terrified child. "Oh, O'Reilly," Richard croaked, his voice a pathetic whisper. "You came." "Shut up and save your energy," Caleb barked, dropping to his knees. He didn't offer comfort, he offered action. Caleb grabbed the fallen beam. It was heavy, laden with plaster and snow. He braced his boots against the wall, gripped the wood, and heaved. The beam shifted with a grating screech. Richard screamed in agony as the pressure was released, nearly passing out. "It's broken," Caleb assessed rapidly, feeling the unnatural bend in Richard's shin beneath his pants. "I can't splint it here. You'll freeze to death before I finish. You're going on the sled." Caleb turned to Catherine. He grabbed her by the shoulders and hauled her upright. She was dead weight, mumbling incoherently. The paradoxical undressing phase of hypothermia was setting in. She was weakly trying to pull off her coat, convinced she was burning up. "Catherine, look at me," Caleb shouted, slapping her cheek hard enough to leave a red mark. Her eyes fluttered, snapping into brief focus. "Hold this rope. Do not let go. If you let go, you die. Do you understand?" He wrapped the paracord around her gloved hands several times, tying a slip knot so she couldn't accidentally release it. He then grabbed Richard by the collar of his parka and dragged him out of the bathroom, through the snow-filled living room, and out into the howling storm. He unceremoniously dumped the crying man onto the plastic utility sled. "Wrap your arms around the sides. Keep your head down," Caleb ordered. He clipped the carabiner back onto his belt, handed the trailing rope to Catherine, and strapped his snowshoes back on. He looked back at the two of them. They were battered, freezing, and entirely out of their element. "We have to climb," Caleb yelled over the wind. "Do not stop moving." The journey back up the mountain was an agonizing descent into physical hell. Going downhill had been a matter of fighting the wind. Going uphill meant fighting the wind gravity, the deep snow, and the dead weight of two adults. The plastic sled dragged heavily, the edges catching on hidden branches and uneven ice. With every step, Caleb's quadriceps screamed in protest. His bad leg was locking up, the muscles cramping violently in the extreme cold. Behind him, Richard groaned in agony, with every bump his broken leg jostling against the hard plastic of the sled. But it was Catherine who posed the greatest risk. 10 minutes into the climb, the rope went taut, violently jerking Caleb backward. He turned around. Catherine had collapsed. She was lying face down in the snow, the rope still tied to her wrists. She wasn't moving. "No," Caleb growled. "Not today." He unclipped the sled from his belt, leaving Richard temporarily anchored in the deep snow. He waded back to Catherine and hauled her up by her heavy coat. Her eyes were closed, and a serene, terrifying smile was plastered on her frozen face. "It's so warm," she whispered, her words slurring together. "Just let me sleep, Caleb. 5 minutes." "You sleep here, you never wake up," Caleb roared, shaking her violently. He didn't have time for gentle encouragement. He grabbed her arm, swung it over his shoulder, and practically lifted her off the ground. He trudged back to the sled, clipped it back onto his belt, and began to move again, this time bearing Catherine's weight on his right side, while hauling Richard behind him. His lungs burned. The air was so cold, it felt like inhaling liquid nitrogen. His vision narrowed to a tunnel, the edges blurring into blackness. His mind began to detach from his body, falling back on the raw, primal training drilled into him at Paris Island. Step, breathe, pull, step, breathe, pull. He didn't count the minutes. He didn't look up to see how far they had left. He just kept his boots moving, one excruciating inch at a time. The wind battered them mercilessly, threatening to push them off the narrow, unseen driveway and down into the steep, wooded ravines where they would never be found. After what felt like an eternity, Caleb's headlamp caught a rigid, dark, vertical line cutting through the swirling white chaos. It was the timber gate. "We're here!" Caleb gasped, his voice raw and bleeding. He dragged the sled right up to the timber wall. He let Catherine slide down against the solid wood, completely unconscious now. Caleb fumbled with his frozen gloves, forcing his numbed fingers to unlatch the heavy steel drop bar. The wind fought him, pressing the gate shut, but Caleb threw his entire body weight against the timber. It opened just wide enough. He grabbed Catherine by the coat and threw her through the opening into the dark, sheltered air gap. Then he grabbed the rope and hauled the sled with Richard on it violently through the gap. Caleb squeezed through last, pulling the heavy gate shut behind him and slamming the iron bar into place. The change was instantaneous. The deafening roar of the wind was instantly muted, reduced to a heavy, distant thrumming against the outer wall. The air in the gap was still dead and wonderfully stable. Caleb collapsed onto his hands and knees, dry heaving violently as his body tried to process the extreme physical exertion. He spat blood onto the crushed gravel floor, but he couldn't rest yet. He crawled over to the heavy steel door of his cabin, unlocked it, and pushed it open. The warmth of the 65-degree interior spilled out into the air gap like a physical embrace. He dragged Richard inside, first pulling him near the roaring wood stove. Then he went back out, picked up Catherine's limp body, and carried her inside, laying her on the rug next to her husband. Caleb slammed the cabin door shut, sealing them inside the fortress. The silence inside the cabin was absolute, save for the crackling of the oak logs in the stove and the ragged, desperate breathing of the three survivors. Caleb stripped off his heavy outer gear, his base layers soaked in freezing sweat. He looked down at the two people on his floor. Richard was awake, staring at the ceiling, tears streaming down his face, his chest heaving. Catherine was still unconscious, but her shallow breathing was steadying in the warmth of the room. Caleb moved to the kitchen area, filled a kettle from one of his purified drums, and set it on the flat top of the wood stove. He then grabbed his medical kit and knelt beside Richard's broken leg. Richard looked up at Caleb. The wealthy executive was gone. In his place was a man who had stared into the void and been pulled back by the very person he had ridiculed. Richard opened his mouth, his jaw trembling, struggling to find the words. "Caleb, we laughed at you. We all laughed at you." Caleb pulled a pair of heavy trauma shears from his kit and began cutting away the fabric of Richard's frozen pants to expose the fracture. He didn't look at Richard with anger, nor did he look at him with smug satisfaction. He looked at him with the cold, hard pragmatism of a man who understood the unforgiving nature of the world. Laughter doesn't hold thermal mass. "Richard," Caleb said quietly, his voice devoid of emotion. "Hold still. This is going to hurt." Outside, the blizzard raged on, burying the valley in a catastrophic white tomb. The town below was dark, freezing, and paralyzed. But inside the sniper's fortress, the fire burned bright, the walls held firm, and they were alive. The interior of Caleb O'Reilly's cabin was a stark contrast to the sprawling, ostentatious chalet the Dempseys had just lost. There were no vaulted ceilings or panoramic glass walls. The space was utilitarian, built on the uncompromising geometry of survival. The walls were thick exposed logs chinked with heavy mortar. A massive cast-iron wood stove dominated the center of the room, radiating a dry, intense heat that fought back the chill clinging to Richard and Catherine's clothes. Caleb worked with the silent, terrifying efficiency of a combat medic. He didn't offer comforting platitudes. He operated strictly on protocols drilled into him by Dr. Cameron Weiss, the trauma surgeon attached to his unit during the bloody campaigns in the Helmand province. "Don't move her too fast," Caleb ordered, swatting Richard's trembling hand away as the injured man tried to pull his unconscious wife closer to the stove. "You'll trigger ventricular fibrillation. Her heart is starved of oxygen. If cold blood from her extremities rushes back to her core too quickly, she goes into cardiac arrest. It's called afterdrop." Richard recoiled, his eyes wide with a helpless, hollow terror. He was shivering violently, but his gaze was fixed entirely on Catherine. Caleb moved to the kitchen and retrieved several heavy Nalgene water bottles. He filled them with the near-boiling water from the kettle on the stove, tightly screwed the caps shut, and wrapped each bottle in a thick wool sock to prevent thermal burns. He returned to Catherine, gently rolling her onto her side. He placed one bottle in each of her armpits and carefully wedged the third into her groin against her femoral arteries. Core re-warming. Caleb muttered more to himself than to Richard. "We heat the blood returning to the heart." Slow and steady. He layered 3 thick military-grade wool blankets over her, sealing her into a thermal cocoon. Only when Catherine's breathing deepened and a faint flushed color began to fight its way back into her pallid cheeks did Caleb turn his attention to Richard's leg. He knelt beside the older man, adjusting the beam of his headlamp. The heavy trauma shears had cut away the designer winter pants, revealing a horrifying sight. Richard's right shin was swollen to the size of a melon, the skin a mottled, angry purple. The bone hadn't broken the skin, a closed fracture, but the unnatural angular bend halfway down the tibia indicated a catastrophic break. Is it bad?" Richard stammered, his teeth chattering, sweat beading on his forehead despite the chill still lingering in his bones. "Tibia and fibula are snapped," Caleb said, clinically pressing his fingers gently against the top of Richard's foot. "You have a pulse in the dorsalis pedis artery. That means the bone fragments haven't severed the main blood supply. You get to keep the foot, but we have to set it and splint it before the swelling cuts off the circulation completely. It's called compartment syndrome. If that happens, the tissue dies." Richard swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Set it, you mean pull it?" "Yes." Caleb stood up and walked to his gear locker. He returned with a moldable SAM splint, 2 rolls of ACE bandages, and a small olive-drab first aid pouch. He unzipped the pouch and pulled out a single pre-filled syringe. "I have 1 dose of morphine sulfate left over from a medevac kit. I'm giving it to you now. When it hits, you're going to bite down on this leather strap, because even with the morphine, your brain is going to register pain you didn't know existed." Richard nodded weakly, tears spilling over his eyelashes. "Do it." Caleb administered the injection into Richard's thigh. He waited precisely 3 minutes, watching Richard's pupils dilate and his breathing slow as the heavy narcotic took the edge off his panic. "Bite down," Caleb commanded, handing him a rolled leather belt. Richard placed it between his teeth. Caleb knelt at the foot of the rug. He grasped Richard's heavy winter boot with both hands, his thumbs pressing into the heel, his fingers wrapping around the ankle. "On 3, Caleb said. His voice was entirely flat. 1, 2. He didn't wait for 3. Caleb leaned backward with his entire body weight pulling the leg in a straight, violent line of traction. Richard screamed around the leather strap, a guttural, animalistic sound of pure agony that was instantly drowned out by the howling blizzard raging outside the walls. The bones in his shin made a sickening, wet, crunching noise as they ground against each other before snapping back into a rough, anatomically correct alignment. Caleb didn't release the tension. With lightning speed, he slid the rigid SAM splint under the leg, molding it up the sides of the calf to create a U-shape, locking the joint in place. He secured it tightly with the ACE bandages, wrapping from the foot up to the knee. When he finally let go, Richard spat the belt out and slumped back against the floor, gasping for air, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "It's over," Caleb said, packing up his medical supplies. "Keep it elevated. Don't touch the wrappings." Richard lay there staring at the thick timber ceiling. For a long time, the only sounds in the cabin were the crackling of the fire and the muffled roar of the wind, the mockery, the arrogance, the neighborhood gossip. It had all been stripped away by the brutal reality of the mountain. "You knew," Richard whispered, his voice hoarse. "You told me the generator would fail. You told me the cold would break the glass. You knew exactly what was coming." Caleb poured himself a cup of black tea and sat in his armchair, staring at the iron door of the wood stove. "Yitsa, I didn't know what was coming," Caleb corrected quietly. "I just knew that civilization is a thin veneer, Richard. People think they've conquered nature because they have Wi-Fi and heated driveways. But the mountain is always waiting. It doesn't care about your bank account or your dinner parties. It only respects physics, mass heat, and preparation." Richard looked toward the heavily reinforced door, knowing the lethal void that lay just beyond it. "My house. It's gone, Caleb. A tree came right through the roof. Everything we own, gone in 5 seconds. "You're breathing," Caleb replied, taking a sip of tea. "That means you're rich. Go to sleep, Richard. The storm isn't over." For the next 72 hours, the sun did not rise over Boundary County. The catastrophic atmospheric collapse held the region in a stranglehold of darkness, wind, and blinding whiteouts. The temperature outside Caleb's reinforced walls plummeted to an astonishing -48 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chills exceeding -80. In those conditions, exposed human flesh freezes solid in less than 2 minutes. Inside the cabin, time became a localized loop. Caleb maintained a rigorous schedule. Every 4 hours, he checked Catherine's vitals. By the second day, she had fully regained consciousness, though she was weak, traumatized, and prone to bouts of quiet sobbing as the reality of their situation settled in. Caleb fed them a nutrient-dense stew of dried lentils, venison jerky, and root vegetables cooked on the flat top of the wood stove. He rotated the firewood, bringing in frozen logs from the insulated air gap tunnel and letting them thaw near the stove before burning them, ensuring maximum thermal efficiency. His gabion wall was performing a miracle. The 3 feet of crushed rock and earth within the steel mesh had frozen solid, creating an impenetrable barrier against the relentless wind. But on the morning of the fourth day, the rules of engagement changed. The howling wind, which had been a constant high-pitched scream for nearly 100 hours, suddenly shifted in pitch. It dropped an octave, turning into a deep, vibrating hum that seemed to originate from the earth itself. Caleb was in the kitchen measuring out coffee grounds when he stopped. He looked at the floorboards. The water in his tin cup was trembling, sending tiny concentric ripples outward. "What is that?" Catherine asked, her voice trembling from her pallet on the floor. "Caleb, the ground is shaking." Caleb didn't answer. He dropped the coffee tin and sprinted to the narrow, angled window slit. He peered through the thick glass, looking out past the air gap and through the exterior, opening in the gabion wall. Visibility was still abysmal, but he could see the silhouette of the mountain rising steeply behind his property. The sheer volume of snow that had fallen nearly 8 feet in 3 days was defying gravity on the 40-degree incline of the ridge. Suddenly, a sound like a thunderclap echoed through the valley so loud it rattled the cast-iron stove. "Avalanche," Caleb said. The word hung in the air, heavy and lethal. The weight of the snowpack had finally snapped, the weak foundational layer of ice beneath it. A massive slab of snow, thousands of tons of compacted concrete-like ice and debris, had detached from the upper ridge and was hurtling down the mountain directly toward the cabin. "Get against the stove now!" Caleb roared. He grabbed Catherine and practically threw her toward the heavy masonry base of the wood stove. He grabbed Richard by the collar and dragged him across the floor, shielding them both with his own body. 10 seconds later, the white Leviathan hit. The impact was cataclysmic. If the cabin had been a standard structure like the Dempsey's chalet, it would have been instantly obliterated, swept off its foundation, and ground into kindling. But the avalanche didn't hit the cabin. It slammed into the outer gabion wall. The entire structure groaned in agony. The force of the moving snow was equivalent to a freight train traveling at 80 miles per hour. The 3-foot-thick steel cages filled with rock and frozen earth absorbed the kinetic nightmare. The wall bowed inward, the thick timber braces screaming under the immense crushing pressure. Inside the cabin, the floor violently pitched up. Dust and mortar shook loose from the log joints, raining down on them. A deafening, grinding roar enveloped the world, vibrating the air inside their lungs. Then, a wave of snow breached the top of the 10-foot exterior wall, spilling over into the 4-foot air gap. The snow crashed against the actual walls of the cabin, blocking out the last remaining slivers of ambient light through the window slits. The cabin plunged into absolute suffocating darkness, and then just as quickly as it had begun, the roaring stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the storm. It was the silence of being buried alive. Caleb slowly lifted his head, spitting out a mouthful of dust. He flicked on his headlamp. The beam cut through the thick cloud of particulate matter hanging in the air. The cabin walls were intact. The roof held. "Is everyone okay?" Caleb coughed, checking Richard and Catherine. They were huddled together, terrified but unhurt. Caleb grabbed a heavy steel crowbar from his tool rack and walked to the front door. He unbolted the heavy locks and pushed. The door opened a few inches before hitting a solid wall of compacted snow. The air gap, the crucial thermal envelope that had saved them from the wind, was now completely packed with avalanche debris. They were sealed inside a tomb. Richard stared at the wall of snow blocking the doorway, panic finally breaking through his stoicism. "We're trapped. We're buried. We're going to suffocate in here. Oxygen isn't the immediate problem. The cabin has enough cubic volume to sustain 3 people for days," Caleb said calmly, analyzing the density of the snowpack. "The problem is ventilation. If we burn the stove without a clear flue, carbon monoxide will kill us in 2 hours." Caleb walked over to the wood stove. He engaged the damper, cutting off the oxygen supply to the fire and slowly choking out the flames. The immediate source of their heat was gone. "What are you doing?" Catherine cried, pulling the blankets tighter. "We'll freeze!" "The snow surrounding us is an ultimate insulator," Caleb explained, grabbing a tactical folding shovel. "The ambient heat of the cabin will hold for roughly 12 hours, but we don't have 12 hours. He turned back to the partially open front door. "The wall held the brunt of the impact," Caleb said, his eyes tracing the structural lines. "If that gabion wall wasn't there, we would be smeared across the valley floor. But now I have to dig a tunnel up to the surface before the ice hardens into a block we can't pierce." For the next 8 hours, Caleb waged a brutal, exhausting war against the snow. Working in the cramped, freezing space of the doorway, he used the folding shovel to carve a steep, upward-sloping tunnel through the packed avalanche debris. He had to drag the displaced snow backward into the cabin, filling the living area with massive piles of white powder. His injured leg throbbed with a sickening rhythm, the muscles cramping under the intense labor. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. By hour 7, the air inside the cabin was growing dangerously thin, heavy with the carbon dioxide expelled by their desperate lungs. Richard and Catherine were lethargic, struggling to stay awake. Finally, with a vicious thrust of the shovel, the blade broke through nothing. A stream of blinding, pure light poured into the dark tunnel, followed by a rush of crisp, freezing, oxygen-rich air. Caleb hacked away at the opening, widening the hole until he could pull himself up onto the surface. He stood up and looked around. The storm had broken. The sky was a brilliant, painful azure blue. The sun was shining. But the landscape was unrecognizable. The trees were gone. The road was gone. The world was a rolling, terrifying ocean of pristine white. Caleb O'Reilly looked down at his property. His cabin was entirely buried. Only the very top of his reinforced chimney pipe protruded from the snow. But beneath the surface, protected by a fortress of rock timber and sheer iron, well, they were alive. It took 3 more days for the outside world to reach Boundary County. The state of Idaho had declared a state of emergency. The National Guard was mobilized, utilizing massive rotary plows and fleets of UH-60 Black Hawk helicopters to reach the isolated, shattered communities deep in the mountains. The devastation was unprecedented. The combination of hurricane-force winds, -60-degree wind chills, and localized avalanches had leveled entire neighborhoods. On the morning of the 9th day since the storm began, the deep, rhythmic thwack, thwack, thwack of helicopter rotors echoed off the peaks. Caleb had expanded the tunnel entrance and established a small, hardened perimeter on the surface of the snowpack. Using a piece of high-visibility orange paracord and a space blanket, he had crafted a makeshift distress signal. When the Black Hawk crested the ridge, the pilot spotted the orange flash against the blinding white snow. The massive aircraft hovered, kicking up a hurricane of loose powder, before gently touching down on the compacted avalanche surface 50 yards from Caleb's tunnel. 2 National Guard pararescue jumpers clad in heavy Arctic gear leapt from the chopper and sprinted toward Caleb, their rifles slung tight. "Are you Caleb O'Reilly?" the lead jumper yelled over the deafening roar of the rotors. "Yes," Caleb shouted back. "I have 2 civilians below, 1 hypothermia recovery, 1 fractured tibia fibula. He needs a Stokes basket." The medics looked at Caleb in disbelief. They had spent the last 2 days pulling frozen bodies from shattered multi-million-dollar homes down in the valley. Finding 3 survivors fully coherent and triaged at the epicenter of an avalanche zone was a statistical impossibility. Within minutes, the medics were down the tunnel. They secured Richard in a rigid transport litter and carefully hauled him to the surface. Catherine followed, clinging to Caleb's arm as she stepped out into the blinding sunlight for the first time in over a week. As they loaded Richard onto the helicopter, he grabbed the doorframe, stopping the medics for a moment. He looked back at the small hole in the snow, the only evidence that a home existed beneath the ice. Then he looked at Caleb, who stood by the tunnel entrance, his face stoic, his eyes hidden behind his tactical goggles. "Caleb!" Richard called out over the engine noise. His voice cracked heavy with an emotion that stripped away decades of corporate arrogance. "I owe you my life. Everything I said, everything they said." "The mountain didn't care what you said, Richard." Caleb replied, his voice carrying clearly. "It only cared what you built. Heal up." Richard nodded, tears freezing on his cheeks as the medics pulled him inside. Catherine threw her arms around Caleb, burying her face in his heavy parka for a brief, tight hug before she, too, boarded the aircraft. The lead medic turned to Caleb. "We have room for you, O'Reilly. We're evacuating the entire grid. There's no power, no infrastructure left within 50 miles. Caleb looked around at the pristine, silent, brutal wilderness. The air was perfectly still. The sky was endless. "I have enough dry wood for the winter," Caleb said. "And my walls are solid. I'm staying." The medic stared at him, recognizing the unyielding set of the man's jaw. He nodded respectfully, tapped his helmet, and climbed aboard. The Black Hawk lifted off, banking sharply over the ridge and disappearing toward the valley, leaving Caleb entirely alone in the white expanse. Caleb turned and slid back down his tunnel. In the spring, when the great thaw finally came, the snowmelt revealed the true scope of the disaster. The town below was a chaotic landscape of splintered timber, collapsed roofs, and flooded roads. Richard Dempsey's chalet was nothing but a concrete foundation and a pile of rotting debris. But at the end of the winding dirt road, Caleb O'Reilly's property emerged from the ice untouched. The massive outer gabion wall had sustained heavy cosmetic damage. The steel mesh was warped, and several of the outer timber beams had snapped under the immense pressure of the avalanche. But it had done exactly what it was engineered to do. It had broken the back of the mountain's wrath. When the local construction crews finally cleared the road in late May, they drove their heavy machinery up to Caleb's property. They parked their trucks and simply stared. There was no laughter anymore. There were no jokes whispered at the Moose Valley Diner. The townsfolk who had mocked the paranoid sniper now looked upon his fortress with a profound, humbling reverence. They saw the deep gashes in the earth, the shattered trees surrounding the perimeter, and the impenetrable wall of rock and wood that had defied the apocalypse. Caleb was on his roof, quietly repairing a loose shingle. He didn't wave to the crews. He didn't gloat. He simply drove a nail into the wood, securing his home against whatever the sky might decide to throw at him next. Because Caleb O'Reilly knew the truth. Civilization is a fragile, comfortable dream, but survival is a wall built entirely of calluses, foresight, and stone. If you were captivated by Caleb's incredible foresight and the intense survival drama, please hit that like button and share this video with someone who loves a true story of preparation, beating the odds. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you won't miss out on our next thrilling saga. Tell us in the comments below, what would you have done if you were in Caleb's shoes? Would you have built the wall or trusted the grid? How would you have handled the Dempsey stay safe, stay prepared? And we'll see you in the next chapter.